Well, we'd like to welcome everyone to the Sunday afternoon classes from the BYU Library Family History Center in Provo, Utah. As is usually the case, these classes will be recorded and available in recorded format on the BYU Library Family History Center website and also on the BYU Library Family History Center YouTube channel, on which we have over 1,000 videos for your education and help. First of all, we're going to talk today about finding your ancestors in court records. And some of you probably would think immediately that, well, I'd be really glad if I didn't have to have my ancestors in court. But we understand court records to include a lot more than just litigation. Sometimes there's a lot of other records here that are going to be helpful. So that's what we're going to start looking at. I just kind of give you some perspective as to the length of the court records that we have available to us. The Code of Namu originated about 2250 BC in Mesopotamia, and it's the earliest known legal code. So there's been lawsuits around and laws and judges and representatives like that we would call attorneys in courts for almost forever, as there's ever been people, I suppose. So you'll not be running out of possible sources for court records. In fact, the problem you're going to see with court records is that there are so many and there's tons of them. And even it just seems to be overwhelming. But what we're getting today is the tools to handle that kind of a huge amount of information. And that's a thing called full text search, where we can search every word in every document, and handwriting recognition, so that even old documents are now being able to rapidly be made searchable. This is kind of a little bit of history touching base, I guess, with history, and that is that the court system in the United States is based on the English courts and English law primarily. But there's another part of the country that was not all based in English, and that is the community property states. And community property laws can be traced back to the civil law systems by the Spanish and French colonial powers. So if that seems confusing, that there are cases that are community property and the other, what we call English law, going back in time. And then the interesting thing is, in most of the community property states, it only has to do with property. It has to do with anything that's property. Marriage is the first thing that comes up. In an English court law, in English law, the wife's interest in the coverture, the marriage, that's the legal term, was based on what they call dowry, usually 1/3. Could have been higher or lower, depending on the various courts and the states and governments. Community property was 50-50. The wife gets half, the husband gets half. And basically, that means that if there's a divorce, that makes a tremendous difference in the outcome of a divorce in a community property state than it does in a English law state. So what we're talking about here is that, and the reason I bring this up is because you're going to actually see the differences if you look in the different states. If you happen to get into one of the community property states, which are here, there are 9 of them, and you can see those: Arizona, California, Idaho, Louisiana, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, Washington, and Wisconsin. And I have never figured out why Wisconsin ended up as a community property state. It's possible that there's some kind of French influence there, but I don't know the answer to that one. I never have over the years I was practicing law in Arizona, which was a community property state. One of the things that you see that's very evident on this is if you go into looking at deeds. One of the benefits of doing research in court records, including probate deeds and wills and all of those things are considered to be court records. The court records would include a deed, and in the non-community property states, the wife had to actually sign what was called a disclaimer deed. Either that or she had to give up her claim to her portion of the estate of the land. And if the wife failed to sign, then the wife could always come back and sue for her interest in the estate, even if the husband died and it was years after the sale of the land and the transaction of the land. So one benefit of the gray states here is that you may very, very frequently see some reference to the wife and her name, and it's possible that it will tell you her maiden name. If it doesn't, it's possible also that the witnesses to the documents, the witnesses to the deeds and the wills, turned out to be relatives and the wife's relatives, and they may be the lead to finding that elusive maiden name. In the community property states, the wife doesn't have to be joined because the husband only has his half. And so in those states, the issue is can you enforce it against the state if the wife is not it does not join in a contract. Let's say you enter into a contract that's secured by the property and the husband only signs it. In the gray states, the wife and the husband would both have to sign. It'd be absolutely necessary. Otherwise, they would be both jointly liable, and they both had to sign. And in the red states, the community property states, that was not the case in all the situations. So it's possible that the husband's property would be the only property that's subject to a claim. It gets a little more complicated than that. That's kind of a simplistic way of looking at it. But just to be aware that there are these fundamental basic differences across the United States in the way that the law works in various properties and jurisdictions. So that brings up the term of the jurisdiction. Jurisdiction has multiple meanings, but in the law community, a jurisdiction refers to the authority of a specific court to hear and decide a case. So the big issue you're working with when you're practicing law or you're doing research in genealogical records and in law records is you need to know the jurisdictions of the courts because those are where the records are going to be. And there's two different kinds of jurisdiction. It's jurisdiction over the subject matter. So, for example, does this court have jurisdiction to have a property that's not within its jurisdiction? That have to use the same word twice. But let's say you have land in Nevada and you end up suing in Utah. Well, the court in Utah is going to say, we don't have jurisdiction over your Nevada law. You're going to have to sue this in Nevada. So there's limitations on that. And there's also limitations on personal jurisdiction. The same thing. You're liable for this obligation, this contract in California, and that's where you're going to have to go to enforce it because we're not going to sue you over. I mean, we're not going to take a court case that does not pertain to the place where you happen to live or where your property is located. Believe me, this is the kind of thing that the attorneys have to basically learn and understand during their multiple years of learning how to become a lawyer. But the issue here is all of this reflects on the court cases that come out. Now, the good news about that is once all of that is decided and the records come out, you don't have to know all that. You just have to know the records and be able to find your people in the records and understand a little basic law to understand the wording and so forth. So we'll kind of get to that issue in just a second. In the United States, court systems operate on a number of jurisdictional levels. The jurisdiction depends on the level of the court. So the first level are local municipal courts, and they have very limited jurisdiction. That means they can only hear certain kinds of cases having to do with, for example, parking tickets. And they also have a boundary or jurisdiction, which means they only can hear cases pertaining to their particular municipality or town or or village or whatever. So these are local courts. Then courts with county jurisdiction. We have counties all over the United States. All the states have counties. There's over 300 counties in Texas, and there's only 15 counties in Arizona. There's counties are big or tiny or whatever, but they generally have a court associated with that county. Once again, the jurisdiction of that court is inside that county and generally does not extend to any other county. Now, if you have a state like Arizona, the main county in Arizona is Maricopa County, with the majority, almost the vast majority of the population of the whole state, and the fifth largest city in the United States. And so the county jurisdiction in Maricopa County in Arizona is gigantic. It's huge. In other counties across the United States, there may be one or two judges. Then you have state courts, and each state usually has a court of appeal, meaning that there are some kinds of cases that can be appealed to a higher court. And then there's the highest court, which are generally correspond to the term supreme. And one other thing that makes this interesting as you go across the United States is that almost all of the names of these courts change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So what happens at the level, each level court is going to fall into one of these categories, but what they call it in the state may be very limited to that particular state. Now, as you're doing research for genealogy for your ancestors, they may have lived in dozens of different states across the during the term of the country. They may have moved from colony to colony in the early colonies. They may have moved continually across the United States during the time that they lived in the United States. And so attorneys, I guess, have a little bit of advantage with that, is that attorneys are generally only authorized to practice law in the jurisdiction where they are admitted to practicing law. That means that there's a procedure to appear and work in the court system in a particular jurisdiction. So, for example, I was an attorney in the state of Arizona. If I came into Utah or to Nevada or Colorado or Idaho or someplace, I would have to go through a special procedure and be kind of sponsored into the court in order to make an appearance in those other jurisdictions outside of where I was authorized to practice law. That makes a lot of difference when you're trying to find people in the court cases, because with this whole idea of jurisdictional gives you a whole different sets of documents that go with these courts, some of which are useful in a genealogical sense, and some of which are less useful. And essentially, the higher the court that you get into the court system, meaning into courts and federal court system, then your jurisdictions are wide enough that you can find more and more information about what's going on. So now you also have the federal district courts and the U.S. Supreme Court. And in addition to this, just to make life interesting, you have across the United States, you have numbers. The number is not, would have no way of getting the total number, but they have the number of administrative courts that exist in all these jurisdictions. These are actions which happen in a particular court system. In Arizona, for example, where I practiced law, liquor issues were done under the Liquor Commission, and there were other state courts. They have what's called the Register of Contractors, and the contractors, if you took an action on trying to say that your house was built improperly, then you would be going to an administrative judge in the area of the Register of Contractors. So there's all this other types of actions. And as I said, there's an abundant number of legal documents and records that you're going to be able to find in every state in the United States. And just to emphasize this again, every state in the USA has a different court system. They're named differently, they operate differently, and they have a different way of recording and reporting the cases. Now, when you get into the federal court system has uh, basically a universal way of reporting all their cases, and it's much easier to deal with the information that's contained in the federal court system. Right now, it's almost 100% searchable online. So that's one difference. And the court systems in the individual states, many of the cases, especially the courts of appeal and the Supreme Courts, are probably completely searchable today online. But many of the administrative courts and the local courts, such as city and county courts, may not be. One other thing that to understand is that the longer that a case is in the court and the more complicated it is and the more people that are involved, you're going to have the more extensive records. So if you think of a court case as having a beginning with the filing of some kind of an action, a complaint, or whatever, a request for hearing, basically then those cases which are filed that way will work their way through the court, and there'll be various stages in each of the court procedures. This is called court procedure, and there are rules for how a court case goes through the court system called the rules of procedure. You have the rules of federal procedure, you have the rules of state procedure, and there may be separate sets of rules for each of the counties. So attorneys have a tendency to work in the courts that they're familiar with, and they would pass it off to someone else if they were not familiar with the procedures of the cases. So in my case, for example, my specialty, if you wanted to say what my specialty was going to court. I was a trial attorney. So when the court case got big enough to go to trial or became whatever, the people could not agree and they really did want to go into court and get a decision from a judge, then many times those cases would be turned over to me to handle. And the subject matter of the case didn't really matter. It could be a case about a defective car, or it could be an accident case, somebody drowned in a swimming pool, or it could have been a house defect. Anything that happened to go to court, I was the one who went to court. That's because once you get into that court, I know the rules. I knew the rules because that's what I had learned to do. And learning the facts was just something you had to do in every case anyway. And so there were some attorneys that did not like to go to court, and so I was the guy. This is just kind of an example. This one comes from Maryland, and this is in one of the Maryland courts, and this is the Office of the Register of Wills for Baltimore County. Baltimore is also a city, and so it's a independent city. So there are courts in Baltimore City, and there are courts in Baltimore County. And in this case, this is just an idea. Here, there are 19 different documents here in this list. And one of the things that makes it interesting and makes it a little bit challenging to look for court records is the fact that all of these documents may not be in the same file, depending on how the court handles their documents. They may essentially assign a number to the case, and then as documents come in, they could be filed by the name of the case, by the name of claimants and the plaintiffs and defendants in the case, or they should just in alphabetical order or in chronological order. In other words, there's going to be a lot of different ways. So in some courts, all of these records may end up in the same file, physical file folder, which would mean that when they were digitized or became digitized and filed, that they all ended up in the same file. And so everything there, you could read them in a chronological order and see how everything proceeded in the case and who was named and how they were, in this case, a will case, how those people were related. And then in other cases, in other jurisdictions, every one of those pleadings may be in a different part of the court system under the same number. And there's usually some way of going through all of those documents. So this is a challenge, and it's one of the ways that makes it, let's say, more difficult and a little bit more interesting. For general ideas, the court systems in the United States are mostly uniformly divided into judges who hear civil cases, meaning cases that have to do with disputes between two different entities, like two different people, two different companies, two different corporations, two different whatever, or three or four or five or six or 100 or 1,000. And criminal cases. And criminal cases are limited to those things and those cases that are specifically defined as criminal actions. And in those cases, the person bringing the action is the governmental person, the entity of the government. So, generally speaking, a general criminal case in most all the states would be the state of, like the state of Mississippi versus the defendant, who would be probably a criminal case. Now, that doesn't mean the state can't bring other kinds of actions, like, for instance, property disputes and actions to enforce rules and regulations and things like that. But in general, criminal cases are defined very narrowly in whatever laws, statutes, and laws that have been enacted in its particular state and into the federal government. And something is either defined as criminal or it isn't. And if it isn't defined as criminal, then it's civil. So to get into criminal actions, it actually had to be something that was specifically defined by the law of the state as a criminal action. And then what we get into that's pretty quick, that's something you'll understand. Most of the time when you see a decision by a court, it comes from what are called courts of record. Now, courts of record mean that they are required to issue a written explanation of how they decided the case. And this is where a lot of the information becomes really helpful and very, very useful for genealogical records. Courts not of record can issue written decisions. But mainly what they say is you win, you lose, and that's the end of the case. Any case that is appealed goes from the courts that are not of record into a court of record. So these actions, any action you see here, may have been brought in a general jurisdiction, a case from a state court with general jurisdiction that was taking this type of case. And if they didn't like the way the judge decided it, then it would go, or jury decided it, they would be appealing to the next level. When they get into the next level of case, it is generally a court of record, which means that they would, in most cases, write some kind of a decision of the case. This could be a one paragraph decision. It could be hundreds and hundreds of pages decision. So all the courts of appeal in the federal court system are courts of record, and the district courts issue written decisions, but not all of those decisions are published. The court may issue a written decision, but if they determine that it is not important enough to create any kind of future decisions called res judicata based on previous decisions, then some of them aren't published. If it's not published, it's not published. That doesn't mean that it isn't available in some cases, that you can actually go in and look at the unpublished decisions. What that means to the attorneys is that if it's not a published case, they can't use it as a basis for further decisions. That's the basic way that the English court systems work, is that, and the United States, is that a case once decided becomes part of the law, and the actions of, and what the attorneys do when they build a case or when they take a case is to go through and look through all of the case law that may appear to pertain to that particular issue, and they use that information to make an appeal to the court. And it as happens, and has happened to me from time to time, court cases started out being on one issue and ended up being on a completely different issue. And on appeal, the person who won in the court below lost in the court on appeal, or was ordered to go back to trial in the court. the thing about the court cases is they can go on for a very, very, very long period of time. Just before I began law school, about 3 months before I began law school, I got a job in the ASU Law Library, which was in the same building as the law school. And because I had a fairly extensive background working in libraries. And because of that, I became familiar with all the records. There was in the ASU Law Library, which is now moved and now is a whole different part of the city in Phoenix. Basically, it was in Tempe at Arizona State University, but then now I don't know exactly where the law library is anymore. That would not have been Judith, so it has been more than 12 years since I even close to practicing law. So what we're talking about here is that what happens with these actions. And when I got back to when I came into the library, one of the first things I noticed is there was a room, a sizable room with shelves, bottom, packed with shelves and all sorts of materials in there, and just it was a sizable room with all four walls, basically shelves of books. That was one lawsuit in there. That was the Colorado River adjudication, and it had gone on for tens of years. And so there were tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of pages of information in that one case. And so understanding that these huge cases go along and that smaller cases go along and that the amount of information that's being accumulated is tremendous, it just seems like it would be helpful to know how to get into it and begin to understand it, because those things may solve some of this, what we would think to be unsolvable questions about what happened to our ancestors and why they moved from here to there, or why they suddenly died and what happened to all the rest of the people, etc. Now, when you talk about the law, that is very hard. People would say, well, that's against the law. And you go, exactly what he is talking about. Which law are you referring to? And generally, when those people say that, they mean the criminal law. They think that something's going to get you in trouble criminally, and that's against the law. Well, the law isn't quite that black and white once you get out of the criminal law situation. In criminal law, you're either guilty or you're not guilty. And then whatever sentence you get is dependent on a lot of rules of the court and the statutory determinations and the discretion of the judge and all the other things. In civil law and the regular case law that goes on and on and on every day in the world today, that law is based on two things. It's based on laws that are passed by legislatures, and it's also based on something called res judicata. That means that the law rules. And what that means is that it's based on all the cumulative decisions of the judges in that particular jurisdiction that apply. And in other jurisdictions, you can always bring in other areas of the law to argue. So a great deal of the time of anybody like me who was involved in litigation continually, it was dedicated to doing research. I started out doing research in books, and then I switched to research online, and that was a lot faster and a lot easier. Today, it's even faster because we're getting into possibilities of AI helping and doing the research. Not that it's going to help us write the briefs, and we have to be sure that what we write is not made up by some AI chatbot. These are just a couple of law books. When we talk about law books, they're usually compilations that tell you about how the law has been decided and how it is different over time. So these are the kinds of things that would be textbooks. Monahan's Real Property Books was my textbook in law school. The Law Institute is a way where they have summarized the law as it exists and also is kind of of opinion how it should be. decided or how it should be conducted. So there's also a set of books that contain copies of the court records. So these are all, they're called a reporter system, and this one happens to be, all these happen to be done by a company called Westlaw. And these books are very, they're in the United States, you're likely to see these books in almost any law firm that was involved in any kind of litigation. And so you can see the numbers there. This is the third series, and they're into 400s of volumes, and they're probably into many higher numbers of volumes. So what's happened over the time period since I began practicing law is that all this came online and became completely searchable through computer programs. The one thing that's also important to understand is that there's extensive law libraries across all of the United States. And if you simply go ahead and do a quick Google search and say, where's a law library for the state of Utah, or the state of Kansas, or Mississippi, or Florida, the answer is going to come back and you'll find out where the law library is located. Sometimes those law libraries are located in conjunction with a law school. So if there's a school of law for giving a law degree, then that may be there. They may have the law library right there with it, like they were with us. But there were also a county law library and there was a state law library. So in most of the states. So this is where the information has been for years. Now, it's possible that all of the information on the law books and the law cases in a certain jurisdiction may not yet have been digitized, may not be searchable. In that case, going and looking at the actual books is going to be searchable. It's going to be where you're going to be able to find that. It's been a lot of years. Many years ago, I went to a county in Illinois, and we went in the courthouse to find where the records were. And we were taken into a fairly gigantic room with ceilings about 12 or 15 feet high and just solid walls of books. And the question was, is this been digitized? Is it available? And the answer was no. So it's possible that if you're doing extensive research in genealogy or in law, but in genealogy, that you may still have to go back and get into all of these different law books. Now, law libraries still maintain physical books, even though there's digital resources. It's because they're law libraries. Another thing is that they may only keep very specific ones that are needed as kind of reserves or rare books. In addition, a law firm may have a whole bunch of books still. As we moved into our one office to another, one of the first things we did in the new office was get rid of about 95% of all the books. We kept a few books in some bookcases, and the reason for that was basically to impress clients that we actually had something that we were going to look at the law. It's a little more psychologically impressive if you're sitting in front of a big bookcase full of law books than if you have it all on your phone. So that's, kind of the way it works. And all I can say is that most of the law firms have long since dumped their paper law books for online legal services. It's just the amount of law is so vast, and the cost of having and storing all of those books and the rental space that you have as a lawyer are all things that mitigate against having extensive books and book collections anymore. So then the question is, how do you get into it? Just kind of a side note here, the Library of Congress is the largest law library in the world. The Congress makes the laws in the United States to some extent, along with every other law agency there is. And the legislatures, both the Senate and the House of Representatives, all their documents are in the care and keeping of the Library of Congress. It is Congress's library. These are some of the large online law research websites. They're all very expensive. They have different ways of charging. Sometimes they charge by the number of searches. Sometimes they charge a flat fee plus searches. But there's just different ways they work out. The two biggest ones are LexisNexis and Westlaw, which is now owned by Thomson Reuters. And there's this one up in the corner up here. Calidus is a AI-based law website. Now, here's what's going to happen with law cases. The issue is, can they be copyrighted? And the answer is absolutely not. All case law is not copyrighted. Can it be copyrighted if it's put in a book and or put on a website? The answer is still can't copyright it. But you can make it so that in order to get access, that you can charge access to get to that. And that's how these companies make money. And when I say they're expensive, I mean they're really expensive. Now, how would you get access if you were just a regular person and you wanted to go out and see if there's something you could do to get to this? Well, one thing that you can do and I'll show in a couple of minutes, is that a lot of this is online and you can do searching for that's available on Google or other browsers, Chrome and some of the other browsers. Now, no matter what you think, it is very likely that some of your ancestors and relatives were in a court case. Now, here's why. Because probate files were handled by the court. And what is a probate file? That's the disposition, who gets the property when a person dies. Today, we have a lot of different ways of handling property when people die with trusts and other things. But in the old days, there was probate, and the probate cases were definitely possible. They had to be probated no matter what the value of the estate. So in the probate cases that I've looked at, it could be a saddle, a black kettle, and a pair of boots. That's it. Or it could be silver spoon and some needles. Or it could go into dozens, if not into hundreds of pages listing the property that was in the estate. So these are all things that you understand as if why this is valuable for genealogical research is because from almost the minute that the Pilgrims and the people that settled in Virginia and at Jamestown got off the boat, they were getting into court issues and cases that needed to be decided. The reason for that was they immediately obtained property, and there immediately were disputes over property, and they immediately got married, and there were disputes over marriage interests, and they immediately got in fights with their neighbors and people in their community, and those needed to be resolved in some way by courts or by the city council or whatever. And so we almost immediately began getting a lot of records together that become extremely valuable in reconstructing exactly what was going on in those early communities and even today. So here's one way that you can get into this fairly quickly without having too much problem. This is called Google Scholar. It's part of Google. And you'll see there that there's two buttons that can be clicked. One is for articles, and the other one is for case law. And the case law one is every state, and these are all the courts, the courts of record, meaning they have records. They're all published, and you can search all the records in the country, or you can go through and click the records that you want to search through. So my father was an attorney, and I was one also. We also did cases together on occasion. And let's go search all those jurisdictions to see if I'm in there with my father anyplace. There's millions of cases of reported case law. So here you've got all these different cases. If you go down a little bit, these are cut off, so you'd have to click on each one to see actually who is in it. But as you get down low, you'll see first one there's called Tanner and Associates, and then down the Overson and Cowley, there's my father and I on the same case. So there's not only a way to find the information about all the people that were involved in each of the cases, there's a way to see who was representing those people. So here was one case. This is the Elverson Cowley case that was back in 1982, and it was decided in 1983, and then it was brought up for review, which means it was appealed to the Court of Appeals, and that was in court. So it was in court for a few years. But the important thing here to ask is, do these cases have any genealogical significance? Is there any reason what I would want to know about this case if I were doing research about my family? And the answer is, yeah, you better know this stuff, because here is going to be a lot of times an explanation for what otherwise seems to be almost impossible to find what happened, because things are going to happen and seem to happen without any rational reason. And then when you get into the court, it's still irrational. But anyway, that's just possibility. But even then, you'll have at least an explanation of what was going on in the family. This is very much when you're involved in divorce actions, whether you are involved in the probate actions, if you're just involved in lawsuits back and forth between each other. And this one is an argument over 40 acres of land in Arizona. In this case, went on for quite a while. So what you're going to see here is that part of what the court will review is the testimony that was given. And you understand that the transcript of the case is still probably available. So this decision case, if you went and did more research in the libraries and online, you may very well come up with the testimony that was given, and which can talk about people and their relationships and what they were trying to obtain through the lawsuit, all of which may have tremendous impact on the way you view the family and the way that information, how much information there is so important to what you're able to say. And it has a lot of history about the Oversons, which is one of my family lines. And this particular ruling is 12 pages long, which is not overly long. They could be 100 pages long. But in this case, it was a long, and it mentions a lot of other people who were not part of this, or not necessarily named as the plaintiffs or defendants. And if there's a will involved when somebody dies, if somebody has a will, and it is usually filed with the probate case up until, as I mentioned, up until around 1945, 1950, everybody who died had to go to probate in almost every case. And after that, it began to become more complicated. But there's still a lot of probate actions out there, and they're extremely valuable because they list, in the wills, are usually list the people who were involved in the family and identify them in many cases, and even identify in the cases of sometimes of the women involved, who they're married to and what the relationships are. Now, this is an example of a full text search. And one of the things that Family Search did was they took their millions and millions and millions of probate records, meaning these land records and property records, and they're all full text searched now across the United States. And so you're able to search every word of these documents and every person in the document from the entire country. So if you don't even know where the person died, you could start looking for the person by name and adding more information, in other words, that may be associative words, and find the exact document you're looking for and the information that you're looking for. And our experience at the BYU library right now is that people are breaking through brick wall issues that they've had, simply by virtue of the fact that they now have access to these probate records in a complete search way. Other things that show up are things like marriage certificates. In this case, you'll notice there's handwritten document here, which is transcribed completely on the right-hand side. And that's very helpful, especially if you don't read handwriting too well. And here's a different kind of case that would be. This is a U.S. Court of Private Land case, and it's a different part of the governmental issue, and it's also searchable. And here you can see from Family Search that there's going to be a mark over on the right-hand side for each of these files that are rather extensive. You'll see an icon that means that has a little camera icon that says that that document's been digitized. It doesn't really mean anything anymore because all of the documents on Family Search have been digitized. But then there's this new mark out here that shows that these are full text search. That means that no matter how big that record was, you would search every document in that by any word that could appear. And this is a kind of an example of a document that was obtained by me from the National Archives branch in Denver, Colorado. It took me a while to figure out where the court would have been. I knew that my great great grandfather had some problems with the laws back in the days of polygamy, but I didn't know anything about the case or anything about when or where, and no one in the family would have ever talked about it. But anyway, I was able to track down the record, and now those records are available online. And I don't know if you look at it as fortunately, but unfortunately, I think it's very fortunate that you basically have an opportunity to learn about the law, to get into the records. And one last thing that, of course, that you need to know is how do you understand all this? How you're going to get through the legal jargon and get into what all this stuff means. And in a sense, it's like learning a foreign language. One of the things that happened, I was working, as I mentioned, in the law library, and I worked in the law library for all the time that I was going to law school. And the law library job put me in a position to see what was going on with all the students in the law school. And on the beginning days of the semester, fall semester, when the new law students came in, it was a kind of an entertaining thing because what happened is that the second that the classes were over, there would be this stampede of all these law students racing to grab the dictionaries and try to decipher what the law professor had just said to them. The reason why I wasn't doing that was because my father was a lawyer and I've grown up in a whole law atmosphere. And I was sitting in there in the law library, and anything that I needed to look up, I could look up automatically. So the idea here is that we have this vast amount of information that deals with individual people and individual families across the entire country through the entire history of the United States back to colonial days. And we should use it. We should use it. And even though it's a challenge, there's ways to learn this, and you can begin to get into understanding the language. I can tell you right now that it's no more difficult getting into legal documents than it is to get into a language that's not your own. If you're wanting to do Scandinavian research or Eastern, Western European research, and you don't happen to speak German or French or Spanish or Danish or Swedish or whatever, you can learn it. You can learn enough to do the research. And it's the same thing with doing research in the courts. Okay, well, thanks for watching.